back to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, and I'm very pleased to be here. As you know, on Whiskey Politics, we like to delve into the issues with political luminaries, writers, and pundits, and really go beyond the 30-second sound bites that we're seeing on the cable news with the spokesholes yelling at each other. Here we really want to delve into those issues that folks like us, political junkies if you will, really care about. And one such luminary is Daniel Greenfield. Daniel Greenfield is a frequent columnist at Front Page Mag, and you can find that at frontpagemag.com. And he runs the best named political blog on the internet, and that is called Sultan Knish, and that can be found at sultanknish.blogspot.com, where his articles and investigative pieces have been cited by Rush Limbaugh, John Horowitz, and Michelle Malkin, to name a few. And he is also the Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Welcome, Daniel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining me on this fine day.
It's a beautiful day, in fact, as well. First of all, and I know that I know the answer here on it. It's probably going to be disappointing a few folks, but everybody's going to be wondering, where did the name Sultan Knish come from?
It's top secret. I mean, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. Then I'd have to hunt down everybody watching this, and that would just be too much work.
It's just too much time.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Well, thanks for that. I want to jump right into something that is gaining a lot of attention right now on Ricochet. A lot of comments, a lot of people are talking back and forth, and that is an article that just came out yesterday. Today is May the 2nd. Yesterday was May Day, and cities around the world are still cleaning up their mess from the May Day rallies. Your front page piece on the New York Times article that basically said, when communism inspired Americans. You said, and I'm just going to quote here, Nazis don't get a form to pour out their romantic nostalgia for attending Hitler rallies. Communists do it because the left sympathizes with them. Talk about that a little bit more detail, and from the standpoint of not just the media and the New York Times, but really kind of a difference of communism and the Third Reich.
Yeah. So Nazi nostalgia is completely off limits, which, it should be. Even Confederate nostalgia is off limits these days. We've taken down Confederate flags, we're taking down Confederate statues. But communist nostalgia, the left which insists on wiping out nostalgia for the Confederacy, is still on board with nostalgia for communism. And this New York Times article is just the latest manifestation. These keep popping up in the media over and over again. And for example, one of the news articles about the Portland riots just casually mentions these two people were just carrying Soviet flags. One of them teaches kindergarten, as if there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And this really shows the clashing double standards. Communism is considered idealistic. They will say, okay, well, Stalin went overboard, the Soviet Union made mistakes, there were some negative outcomes, but they meant well. That's really the theme of the Gornick New York Times piece. It's the general theme when they're discussing communism. Yes, they made some mistakes and Stalin was nasty, but they really had good intentions. And that's not something you see directed at Nazis or at the Confederacy or any other past revisionism. And it is revisionism. That's what we're dealing with. There's historical revisionism in insisting that the communists meant well, that they just made some mistakes, that there were unfortunate problems. It's the equivalent of during the days of the Soviet Union, when people would insist, if only Stalin knew what was being done. And then it was discovered, yes, Stalin apparently did know, but now it's all the people who were Stalinists who supported the Soviet Union, if only they had known all along. This is historical revisionism. Communism was built from the ground up as a totalitarian ideology. It was built on mass murder. And these kinds of massacres have been happening long before. So we have these romantic myths. These myths are fundamentally destructive because they keep the same mistakes happening over and over again. The left is still a totalitarian movement, and much of what it's doing, it's repeating the same fundamental errors because they haven't been disproven. There's just this idea that there was Stalinism, that Stalin was bad, but that, if we do this in a nicer way, if we do this with a so-called human face, then it's going to be okay. And this is why we have the continued conflicts that we do.
It's interesting, you talk about revisionism, and a lot of that is being seen right now in how children are educated, what they are told, and really more importantly, what they're not told anymore. There's a question, and I want to throw a few questions to you from some Ricochet members, and this is a two-part question in relation to the education system. Ricochet contributor Susan Quinn asks, how do we get a more balanced picture of history to be taught in schools? I know some school districts have been working on this strategy, but it seems like a slow slog.
Well, the larger problem with history is that the history that's now being taught is part of a political agenda. So there are more conservative districts where parents do attempt to fight back and push for things. Obviously, out here in Southern California, that would be much more of a challenge. But overall, it's important to recognize this is an ideological struggle. It's not an accident that the history that's being taught is bad. Even teachers themselves are increasingly being trained on texts like Pedagogy of the Oppressed. When they're in college, they're reading A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. So what they're doing is shaping a particular agenda, and publishing houses, which themselves are educational publishers, in many cases themselves are on the left, and they're certainly very much eager to cater to this. So it's important to get the right textbooks. It's important for parents to know exactly what's in the textbook and to really understand the agendas of the left, because if you don't understand the agendas of the left, you don't really understand what to look for.
So if we understand the agendas of the left, and as conservatives, you're looking for less centralized government. There's some folks that would like to abolish the NEA, have more local control over education. How do you assure, and this is actually one of the debates that are going on right now with Ricochet, how do you ensure that there's a standardized lessons that everybody, no matter where they are in the country, are going to learn specifically about certain aspects of what we believe should be learned when it comes to history?
I don't think central standardization serves conservatives. I don't think, for that matter, these days it serves America. It might have been the case in, say, 1920. These days, anybody who's going to be handling the standards, 9 out of 10 times is just going to be on the left. They're going to be pushing a destructive agenda. When parents are actually involved in schooling, when they're involved in education, they're going to see to it that the standards are there. They might not completely match nationwide, but really, to some extent, the whole obsession with national standards, with making everything equivalent, is really unnecessary, and it's to some degree a progressive idea, if not necessarily a left-wing idea. And frankly, it hasn't worked. Trying to standardize the education system on the model of a factory to produce the same exact results never works, because you have cultural differences. You have differences from one area to another. Expecting that students in Newark are going to follow the same exact standards as the students in Salt Lake City is just frankly unrealistic. It's not going to produce the intended results. And every few years we try to tackle a new strategy for standardization. And at the end of the day, these strategies are a disaster. I mean, look at the backlash against Common Core. The more you try to put everybody in the same box, the more the box is just going to fall apart.
So I guess there's... When we were talking about the education from a macro standpoint, you do want to go local. You do want to have a governing body that can oversee, obviously, what is going to be taking place locally for your children. But there's been a significant amount of damage that has already happened. And it's not just recently. It's been going on since the 50s and the 60s.
Yes.
In fact, Ricochet member Right Angles asks, do you see a way we can ever overcome the damage the American left has done via our school system since the 1970s?
Well, one approach is basically to completely, comprehensively decentralize it, which means basically eliminate this kind of standard public education system, make vouchers possible, make it possible for parents to send their students to Catholic school, to whatever local school there is, create more competition, create more differing standards, because the more you centralize, the more one group of people has the ability to control education. And, the whole idea of the free market is that there should be options. There should be options at the college level. There should be a lot of options at the high school, at the middle school level. The more we create alternatives, the left will be able to send their children to the kinds of schools they want, but so will normal Americans. And I think that's really the best outcome, because trying to take control of the system itself is always going to be a losing strategy. We see how much difficulty conservatives have taking control of the federal government with Trump. Trying to take control of the education, which really, as you've mentioned, the left has been burrowing into that for generations, I think would be Stalingrad.
Wow. Much of this stems from cultural issues. There's differences in people's opinions on how we should proceed forward in the culture. Obviously, we all have our issues that people focus on. But you wrote an article that got tremendous play on social media. I think it's been shared over 100,000 times at this point, and it's called "The Civil War is Here." You refer to the political conflicts become civil wars when one side refuses to accept the existing authority. The left has rejected all forms of authority that it doesn't control. What's going on here? This is pretty scary stuff we're seeing.
Well, we're dealing with a major crisis. The current riots, the so-called resistance, is only the latest manifestation of it. So the left does not accept any authority that exists outside its ideology. It's rejected the results of 2 presidential elections by Republicans in the century. At this point, whoever a third Republican who might win a presidential election is, it doesn't matter who he is. He could be Kasich, it could be Graham. The left is going to say he didn't win fairly. The Russians did it. The Spanish did it. The Supreme Court did it. The Martians did it. They're going to have some excuse for explaining why he's illegitimate. And when the Republicans hold the Senate is illegitimate. When the Republicans hold Congress is illegitimate. When the Republicans have their way in the Supreme Court is illegitimate. The only legitimate institutions are those controlled by the left, and that's effectively a rebellion. It's sedition. It's what amounts to a kind of, for the moment, mostly nonviolent civil war.
I mean, this gets scary, especially when you start seeing some of the folks that are out there right now that are acting out. I mean, we've got masked hooligans that are, obviously attending these, in some cases, right-of-center rallies, pro-Trump rallies. They're showing up in masks. They look like ISIS. Antifa, I think, is one group. You've got free speech issues at different colleges and such. Ricochet member Aaron Miller asks, what is the least destructive outcome you can imagine from our civil war? What do you hope for?
Well, the civil war is taking place at different levels. So there is a conflict within the government. You have the conflict with the bureaucracy against the Trump administration. But what they've done is they've declared resistance. Now, you don't resist a government, a political opposition. You will oppose a political opposition. You will oppose the current government. You try to protest them. But once you talk about resistance, you resist the Nazis, and that's their basic argument. Once you declare that the Republicans, that the Trump administration are the Nazis, well, anything you do to them is basically fair game. So you can take some baseball bats and start smashing heads because that's the resistance. You can start blocking traffic. You can start sabotaging them. You can accuse them of anything and everything. And that's really the central problem. The central problem is that Democrats, and now they're under the control of the left, have declared that anybody on the right is fair game for anything at all. So fair game, we've seen violent riots, we've seen what happened at Berkeley, but we're also seeing just the attack on the government. So at this point, you basically have to force the left to step back one way or another, which means either you defeat them politically or this continues spinning out of control, and that gets us into much more destructive scenarios.
Well, when you talk about defeating them politically, I think the right have done that. They own everything.
They've won elections, yes. They haven't come close to defeating them politically.
So what does that look like?
Well, politically, actually, we have to actually look at the institutions that are non-elected. So the Republicans are doing great with institutions where you can actually get elected, where you can become an official. They control Congress, they control the Senate, they control the White House. Maybe they'll even control the Supreme Court. But when we're talking about the institutions that actually control public life, a lot of those are not electable. So, for example, colleges, the media, those are institutions that have a great deal of political influence, but at the same time, Republicans have absolutely no sway on them. Now, in theory, Republicans should be able to use their elected political offices to reshape the larger landscape. They haven't been doing that, for that matter. They haven't even seemed to have been able to control the government itself that they've actually won elections on. So I'm not terribly optimistic there, but really this is where the next arena of the battle should be.
Well, it's interesting you said that, because our next topic that I wanted to move into was to avoid the government shutdown. Congress passed a bill yesterday, a budget, that Democrats could only dream of, essentially going against almost everything that Donald Trump campaigned for leading up to the election. It was a pork-laden bill. I mean,
yes.
It was insane. You stated, the only thing this deal doesn't seem to fund is Al-Qaeda. We have a Republican in the White House and increased Republican control of Congress, yet somehow we end up with a deal that funds every lefty priority, Planned Parenthood, EPA, and sanctuary cities, but doesn't fund the wall. What happened with this? Is it to prevent the government shutdown? Is it purely a political, psychological? What's going on here?
So even as a majority party in Congress, Republicans claimed they couldn't get any of their things through because then there would be a government shutdown. Now they're a majority party in Congress, and they've got the White House, and they still can't get any of their priorities through, and the left gets all of their priorities through. And they managed to do it as a minority party. obviously there's something fundamentally wrong here. So you can offer a few diagnoses. One is obviously Republican cowardice. 2 is that there's a lack of leadership and direction. 3, that Democrats actually will pay no price for doing anything, and this actually causes Republicans to be afraid. But if anything, really, anything that the Trump election should have taught them is that just disregard the supposed political price you're going to pay, because you're going to pay the price anyway. And if you actually take action, if you actually do something, you might actually reap some rewards. On the other hand, if you're constantly afraid of what is the media going to say, how are they going to shape public opinion, then you lose by default. And again, this seems to be a case of Republicans snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory.
It sounds like you're selecting out of those options that you put up cowardice.
I think that's really the closest diagnosis we can offer. I think to some degree, there are just cases where the Republicans in Congress don't care very much about a lot of issues. Paul Ryan obviously is not an immigration guy. He's not going to fight for the wall. He's not, and we've actually had increase for visas for Afghans under this. There's an increase for HB2 visas. So this is stuff that Ryan would actually be on board with. But Ryan is supposed to be a fiscal conservative, and this is not remotely a fiscal conservative bill.
Would you believe, I guess, when you have Sean Spicer coming out and saying, look, this is just temporary, we're coming back in September, things are going to be done in September. Donald Trump just this morning dropped a hint that, there'll be a government shutdown, which was the whole purpose of doing this week, was to avoid a government shutdown for the reasons you just illustrated.
So, they've been telling us this for 6 years. I'd like to believe it. We're going to do better in September. But again, they've been telling us this for year after year after year. And at this point, there's no reason for people to have a lot of confidence.
So we're 16, 17 months from the midterm elections. Mm-hmm. Democrats are taking a look at those, wetting their chops. They want to take the House back. They want Nancy Pelosi to jump back into the majority leader seat, and then they want to push for impeachment. This is their plan. If Republicans do not achieve what was promised during the last 6 years, essentially, leading up to this election, with Obamacare repeal and replace, a tax reform bill, if it's not done at an effective level, how dangerous is that for the Republicans in 2018?
Conservatives have pumped huge amounts of money, huge amounts of time and effort into doing this ever since the Tea Party days. People have just sweated blood doing this. People come out for elections and they contribute their time to volunteering, they contribute their money, and they say over and over again, what are we getting for this? And part of really why Trump won was because this frustration. Nobody trusted the establishment, nobody trusted elected Republicans at any level, fairly or unfairly, and so Trump was an outsider and they backed him, and at this point people are saying, what's going on here? What are we supposed to do? And it's entirely possible that a lot of people are just going to sit out the midterm elections, and that would be really, really bad. And again, unless congressional Republicans actually deliver something for the base, unless they show something, this is what we're doing, I don't really have a great argument to make there.
Hope you're listening, Paul Ryan. It's incredible. It's what you just said, snatching defeat out of the victory, the jaws of victory. So let's move on. And again, I greatly appreciate you taking the time with us today. Another subject that I'd really like to get your focus on, and you've written extensively about, is the Middle East, specifically Israel. Hours before Obama left office and Trump was inaugurated, there was a huge, massive check, $200-something million given to Hamas, the Palestinian Authority. Last year, in the UN Security Council, America abstained for the settlement issue. As a stalwart advocate for Israel, you've written much about the U.S. relationship with Israel, especially in what you refer to in the age of Obama and now Trump. First, before we get into some more details on there was an article that you wrote, how Senate Democrats went against Israel. Talk to me a little bit about your impressions of Trump right now versus obviously what we just came from 8 years of Obama in relation to Israel.
Well, certainly under Obama, this was just a nightmare. I don't think anybody really needs much updating in that. Anybody certainly who's in the conservative movement who's aware of this. But even as bad as the Obama years were in his final few months in office, Obama just began picking new fights with Israel. Things got ugly and uglier. The Trump administration has certainly been better in that regard, but at the same time, unfortunately, the State Department is clouded with people, with Obama people, with the same old people, and turnover has been very slow to happen. For example, you have people like Yael Lempert, who's been militantly anti-Israel, who still really has quite a voice on Israel policy. So Trump has put in a few good people, but at the same time, you had the Office of Iranian Affairs in the State Department, for example, being run by effectively a former Iranian lobbyist. So the State Department is a problem. People like Mattis and McMaster are a problem. The Trump administration has been very good on putting people in a domestic policy. And foreign policy, you've had people who are basically Bush people who are, even in some cases, Obama people, just still continuing to control foreign policy. So there's been an improvement, definitely, but it would really take a significant amount of house cleaning at the State Department and elsewhere for it to actually be what it ought to be.
Do you have concerns right now, and I want to get back to your article in just a minute, do you have legitimate concerns right now for the security of Israel in relation to the Iran deal?
The Iran deal is obviously a horrific disaster, and the development of Iranian nuclear weapons would be really terrible for Israeli security, would be terrible for European security, would be terrible for American security. If we look at what's going on with North Korea, back in the day, the Clinton administration tried to make almost the same exact kind of deal with North Korea. We were going to give them a few bribes, we were going to inspect, and everything would be fine. And Bill Clinton got on camera and assured us everything would be okay. There's no way North Korea would get a nuclear weapon. Obviously, now we're dealing with this. And we can just see the escalation of the crisis. And North Korea isn't even as important in some ways as Iran is, because Iran really isn't an important strategic region as far as oil goes. If they continue expanding, we've already seen what they've done in Yemen, what they've done in Iraq, what they've done in Syria. If they continue expanding, they could conceivably put a chokehold on oil. They could effectively blackmail much of the world, economically speaking, and they could actually become the power they want to be. So this is potentially a huge disaster. And it goes without saying that it's a disaster for Israel. Once Iran actually has the confidence to show off nuclear weapons, there's not that much to stop them from, for example, passing nuclear materials to terrorists and effectively saying, if something happens, prove it, and if you attack us, well, we have nuclear weapons too. So can you imagine, for example, a Bernie Sanders administration retaliating for there? Probably not. So we have 48 years in which something really needs to be done about North Korea and something needs to be done about Iran. The Trump administration is making North Korea a priority, which is good, but it also needs to think about Iran very seriously, because 4 years from now, let's say 8 years from now, let's say we're dealing with President Elizabeth Warren, we could be seeing a truly major catastrophe.
You've written extensively about Israel. You're an advocate for Israel. And in fact, you just had a recent article. You labeled it How the Senate Democrats Went Against Israel, which focuses on J Street, the liberal, quote-unquote, pro-Israel lobbying group. You talk about George Soros and his role. How did the Democrats' position just get so wrong over the years when it comes to Israel?
So one of the things that we're seeing in more recent period is that the whole resistance mantra, the opposition to Trump, has been actually a very good insert for the left, for the anti-Israel left, to keep pushing the Democrats further to the left. Now, obviously, the left's takeover of the Democratic Party in and of itself was going to push them further out. We saw that with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was not supposedly coming in with an anti-Israel agenda, but nonetheless, he did keep coming in with an anti-Israel agenda. He accused Israel of killing 10,000 innocent people in Gaza, which not only had Israel not killed 10,000 innocent people, it hadn't killed anywhere close to 10,000 even Hamas people in Gaza. And he kept repeating this lie and defending it over and over again. He tried to water down the Israel platform. He tried to position Keith Ellison, who was a Farrakhan supporter, accused Israel of being an apartheid state, to head the DNC. So all of this has been happening naturally. But also the whole resistance mantra means that the left gets to push Democrats even further into the anti-Israel camp. So one of the things that happened was that Trump nominated for the first time in a very, very long time a pro-Israel ambassador to Israel. Now, what a concept, having a pro-Israel ambassador to Israel, having an ambassador that actually likes the country he's been assigned to. Crazy idea, I know. So the left put everything into blocking him. Now, normally the Senate just confirms whoever is the ambassador. Obama just appointed anybody who gave him over $100,000 ambassador to somebody. He appointed soap opera producer's ambassador to Hungary. She couldn't state what our strategic interest in Hungary was. That was fine. She got in. He appointed John Kerry's cousin, also an ambassador, to England for giving him something like $500K. Again, no problems in the Senate. But Ambassador David Friedman had actually called out J Street, and J Street is the preeminent anti-Israel lobby. So Democrats, aside from, I believe, two voted completely against Ambassador David Friedman, and there was this really incredibly disgusting circus when his nomination came to the floor. Usually it doesn't even go to the entire Senate. One after another of these guys just got up and denounced him, and you had Al Franken getting up and saying that he's going to vote against him because Friedman had called him a clown, you know. Truth is the best defense against libel in some cases. But you had this really bizarre situation where the majority of Senate Democrats, who usually at least pretend to be pro-Israel, had sided with J Street over Israel. And this is really how the whole resistance mantra is pushing Democrats even further to the anti-Israel camp, because you've got to resist Trump. And that means just voting against his nominees. And in this case, J Street and the anti-Israel camp had a perfect fusion with the resistance, which is what I wrote about there.
What's incredible to me is that, unfortunately, American Jews, for the majority of them, don't see it that way. And the BDS movement obviously has taken hold in a lot of universities, including here at UCLA, where speakers are thrown off campus who speak out against it. Do you believe, because this is coming up in the ranks of the American educational system and higher education, that this is going to be a growing problem in the future for American Jews and Israel?
Well, it depends on the future of education, which we discussed previously.
Right.
But again, assuming that we do have universities trending further and further towards social justice and away from any kind of rational, truth-based or facts-based curriculum, then yes, I think that is very likely, because the kinds of social justice curriculum that is expanding, the various ethnic studies, those are very much trending to the left, and the whole intersectionality has fused the Islamic opposition to Israel with, for example, Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter came out with an anti-Israel platform. It's fusing it with a variety of these gay rights platforms, and together you have this kind of united front by the social justice left against Israel. So I think this is a growing problem, but of course nobody can actually predict the future. But it is important for pro-Israel advocates to stand up to this and to make it clear to their alma maters that if you allow this kind of thing to happen on campus, if you allow pro-Israel speakers to be chased off campus, you're not getting any donations.
You've spoken out a lot about anti-Semitism, and you're going to be speaking on fighting anti-Semitism and defending Israel in the age of Obama, Trump, and BDS. I believe this is a lecture that you do. What are your feelings? We spoke about this earlier, but for our audience, what are your feelings about this president compared to the last when it pertains to Israel?
Well, certainly there's a great deal of improvement, and with Obama there was a great deal of room for improvement. Just the years of Obama were a constant war on Israel, and in the last few months, Obama decided to double down. He decided to pick an open fight with Israel. In the past, it had been a covert war. He'd spied on the Israeli government. He'd sabotaged. He tried to rig an election in Israel. But this was just at this point open name-calling. And again, this was deliberate. He was deliberately trying to poison the well. And he did so quite effectively because, as we just discussed, the left is now further anti-Israel than it was before. The Democrats are further anti-Israel than they were before. The Congressional Black Caucus is tipping further into the anti-Israel camp. So this was very much deliberate, and the new administration has the same problem that it does with a variety of fronts, which is that a lot of Obama people have stayed behind. A lot of them continue to function within the State Department. They continue to push policies that are anti-Israel. People like Yael Lampert, who was a militantly anti-Israel figure under Obama, still has quite a voice there. So there's a kind of conflict there. There's an ongoing conflict within the government. It's more visible on foreign policy, really, because a lot of the people that are in on foreign policy are still Obama stay-behinds. They're Bush people, which means they have agendas that are not pro-Israel, to put it mildly. In some cases, they might be pro-Saudi, pro-Iran, but not pro-Israel, while domestic policy has had more of an opportunity to put conservatives in there. But certainly it's been an improvement. There's far less pressure on Israel. There's far less overt hostility to Israel. And both of those are giant improvements. And we're going to see what a year will bring, because this is really very much an infant administration.
And with Nikki Haley at the UN, that certainly bodes well.
Yeah, she's been great, obviously.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you talk about the CBC. And if you take a look at the DNC, where Keith Ellison almost won, chairman of the DNC from a Farrakhan, person who spent $800,000, who has been blatantly anti-Israel for his entire life, all of a sudden is now in love with Israel. I found that quite ironic. So I think that furthers to what you're saying about the different forces that are coming together here.
Well, he's not pretending too hard. I mean, this was the guy who was calling Israel an apartheid state quite a handful of years ago, but he keeps insisting they were just with Farrakhan for a few months, and there's just ample proof, evidentiary proof that this is a complete lie, but the media has been accepting it and in the same way the media will just whitewash his history of anti-Semitism because, again, he's on the left and we're all in the resistance now.
Right. And again, something we spoke of earlier as well, just wanted to touch upon before our last question, and that is Iran. You see the Iran deal where it is right now. I believe Politico came out and said just this week or last week that the Iran deal was a charade. It was, it was patched together and just basically sold like Obamacare almost in a way. What are your feelings about the Iran deal? And another question for you, because you write so much about geopolitics. How do you compare the Iran deal situation right now to, let's say, what's happening today with North Korea?
Well, to answer your second question first, out of order, I would say they're effectively basically the same deal. Even the Obama speech on the Iran deal was ominously similar to the Clinton speech on the North Korea deal, which many people pointed out at the time. Both of them offer completely hollow and empty assurances that an inspection regime is going to stop a totalitarian terrorist state from just developing nuclear weapons. Obviously, that's nonsense. Just to pull back a little, though, what we're looking at is a larger national security crisis because North Korea has been funneling nuclear technology. It doesn't just stop with North Korea. So these various so-called rogue states passed on nuclear technology. There was a pipeline from North Korea to Pakistan, from Pakistan to Iran, from Iran to Syria, and so on and so forth. Libya at one point was developing weapons technology just based on material that they received along this pipeline. So it doesn't stop, and at this point there's a serious risk of Islamic terrorist groups, including one day perhaps Al-Qaeda, getting their hands on nuclear technology if this pipeline keeps running. So it's important for us to stop North Korea. We failed to do that. We can still do that. It's important for us to stop Iran, or we're going to be dealing with terrorist groups that are routinely armed with nuclear weapons.
Wow. And when we start talking about Iran, we start talking about the Shiites and the Sunnis in the Middle East and ISIS and everything that goes along with that. And I want to finish off with one last question from a Ricochet member. Ricochet member Doc J. How do the progressives square their embracing of Islam? Is it hatred of common enemies or delusion?
Well, it's a little bit of hatred of common enemies, but Islam and the left do have a whole lot in common. And plenty of people have written about that, including Jamie Glazov, who's also at the Freedom Center. But the basic summary is both are totalitarian ideologies. Both are utopian ideologies. They believe that the flawed society as of today must be destroyed and must make way for this kind of perfect society. They just disagree, obviously, the details of that perfect society. Now, a number of people will ask this sort of question. They'll point, well, ISIS throws gay men off buildings. How does the left accord with that? But what was Castro's Cuba doing to gay men? What was the Soviet Union doing to gay men? So the left did not have a problem with these supposed conflicts with its ideology because the social stuff is just very much a surface stuff. So they were big fans of Castro even when he was locking up gay men in prison camps. This is not a deal breaker for them. And to some degree, what you see in the Middle East, for example, is the left and Islamist groups aligning. They will overthrow the government, and then they will get into a power struggle over who's going to run things. Inevitably, of course, it's the Islamists who run things. That's what happened in Iran. That's what happened in Egypt. But first, the left is going to ally with various groups to overthrow whatever the existing establishment is. And you can even view the Hitler-Stalin pact in now, right? So they will ally with fascists. They will ally with Islamists, so long as it's overthrowing a kind of mainstream, middle-of-the-road democratic government. And then they will actually try to take over. So from their perspective, using Islamists to overthrow the West makes it possible for them to take over the West.
Fascinating. It's a subject we can talk more and more about for hours, and I greatly appreciate your time. Daniel, where can people find you directly?
Well, my articles are regularly published at Front Page Magazine at frontpagemag.com. I have a blog on Sultan Knish, but really the easiest way is just to Google Daniel Greenfield. I am the only person to come up in the first 3 pages of search results. I apologize for that to all the Daniel Greenfields, including Dr. Daniel Greenfield somewhere, I think, in New Hampshire, who's really probably went to medical school for 8 years and is just having no luck. But really, just Google Daniel Greenfield, I will come up.
Gotta love Google.
Yeah.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time, and we'll hopefully be able to talk to you again soon. And for those of you that following us on Whiskey Politics and on Ricochet, you can find this on YouTube if you want to see it, and if you want to hear it, don't forget to join us at iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, where you can hear this and all of our interviews just by subscribing. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time at Whiskey Politics.